In 1983, Chrysler introduced the minivan to the world.
One vehicle that takes the place of an economy car, sporty car, station wagon, and van. Dodge Caravan is a transportation revolution.
And there's only a few vehicles in history that have so completely revolutionized their space, that have introduced a new vehicle concept to the world and forced other manufacturers to respond to it. This video, I'm going to tell you the interesting, fascinating story of the development of the minivan. I'm going to go through its 6 generations and some of the powertrain options through there, what I think of it, and how I'm so impressed that for the most part, Chrysler didn't sit on their laurels. They constantly innovated the minivan to try to keep their leadership. And again, it took nearly 10 or 15 years before other manufacturers finally figured out a way to compete with them. It's a great story, guys. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back, my friends. I appreciate it. And the minivan, it is the car we love to hate and we hate to love. The fact of the matter is like I said at the intro, there are very few cars, the Mustang springs to mind, that carved out its own niche and forced other manufacturers to respond to it. Some of the numbers I've seen here is that Chrysler has sold over 15 million minivans up through about 2019. It's a massive, massive success over 6 generations. But what's fascinating to me is the story doesn't start with Chrysler, or not exactly. While Chrysler gets the reputation of having introduced the minivan, right? It actually started with Ford back about 1972. See, Ford had their full-size vans, and they were designing what would have been the 1975, I believe it was, Econo line. But this was really big. And Lee Iacocca and a gentleman by the name of Hal Sperlich worked at Ford, and they knew that there was a market for a smaller, garageable sized van. And they began development on it. They went through the clay model phase, and as a matter of fact, by 73-ish, they had a running platform with a fabricated body on top of it, and it was called the Carousel. Now, they were taking the full-size van and its 124-inch wheelbase. They were going to be probably using the same powertrain, but just making it a smaller body. This is the genesis of the minivan, at least in my mind. There are people who could argue that the Scout Scarab or maybe the Volkswagen Type 2 van would be the predecessor. But Chrysler and the front engine minivan template, Chrysler really set it and honestly got it right from the beginning. Would the Carousel have been as huge a success as the Chrysler minivans? My gut says no. It still would use, they never finalized powertrains, but they still would have used larger engines, probably a V8. It would have been rear-wheel drive. It was still based on that full-size van platform. But at least they were thinking about, quote, that garageable van. Now, the myth is that Henry Ford II hated the program and refused to push forward with it, but that's not actually true. Turns out Henry Ford II was very much in support of it, signed off on moving forward with its development, but several other executives at Ford were opposed to it, primarily because they thought it would cannibalize away from their existing station wagon sales. But it was developing forward until the 73 oil crisis and then the recession of the mid-70s. Ford needed money to plow back into their existing platforms, not into a new market that didn't replace something else that Ford already sold. So they canceled the program. Now, Hal and Lee Iacocca both ended up moving over to Chrysler, and they remembered this. And when Hal got there and talked to Lee, they restarted it. And that's what became the Chrysler Minivan. As a side note, it's worth noting that in the beginning, in the 70s, Chrysler was already working on a garageable van. One of the words for it is a Minimax, but I understand that's a slightly different program as well. And the CEO, Lee Townsend, saw it and canceled it. Wouldn't move forward with production because, quote, if a market existed for it, Ford and GM would already be doing it. All right. So, a little short-sighted, I think we can all look back and see, but Lee Iacocca and Hal started working on it, started developing it, and this, of course, is when Chrysler was going through a tremendous financial stress, and they ended up having to go to the government and get $1.5 billion in loan guarantees. Now, they estimated that the minivan platform would cost about $700 million to develop, and they just didn't have it. So they took $500 million of their loan guarantees and plowed it into the minivan. Of course, the K car was coming, but they put it into the minivan. And this is the most fascinating part of the story for me. You have a company, tens of thousands of workers are depending on you. At one point, Chrysler had a break even of $2 million in sales, and they were only selling like $1 million. I mean, it was really, really bad. They had to go put themselves in front of the public, go through all of the ridicule, and they took 1/3 of what they got out of that and plowed it into not just a new platform, but a vehicle that had nothing comparable in the marketplace. It was a huge gamble. And the sheer cojones of these guys to make that gamble. But they had marketing on their side. They had knowledge, right? They had gone out and they had surveyed potential buyers, and they determined that there was a market of up to 1 million sales a year for this type of vehicle, with Chrysler catching about 215,000 of them. That number ended up being extremely prescient. Now, it's also worth mentioning that Chrysler not only started developing one minivan, but Chrysler Corporation was actually developing 2 minivans at the same time. See, over at Chrysler Europe, they had some partnership with a company called Matra, and they came up with this idea of a one-box people mover. Now, because Chrysler was in such deep financial distress, they ended up leaving the European market. Peugeot ended up buying their assets, including this relationship. But Peugeot didn't want anything to do with this minivan. So Matra actually went and shopped it over to Renault. Renault liked it, began working on it, and that became the very famous Espace, or E-Space as it's pronounced. It's just interesting to me that 2 different departments of Chrysler were both working on the same concept, and they came up with 2 different vans for 2 different markets. So Chrysler began the development of it, and another myth I'm going to go ahead and debunk is that the first generation Chrysler minivans are not based on the K car. The platform is its own platform. It's called the S platform, but to save development costs, they did share powertrain, engine, and transmission commonality with the K cars and interior components, which were kind of scavenged from other Chrysler cars. And in 1983, they unleashed it on the world. So the first generation of Chrysler minivans is called the S platform. It was introduced in 1983, sold as an 84 model through 1990 with a mid-generation refresh. Initially introduced as the Dodge Caravan and the Plymouth Voyager, largely differentiated by some trim and some grills. It was developed with 4 main goals in mind. From 1977 is when they kicked everything back off again. It needed to park in a standard size garage. It had to have car-like noise, vibration, and handling, not truck-like. A low flat floor so it could carry a 4x8 sheet of plywood, and removable seats. I am not going to go through all of the different seating combinations, but we'll touch at least on the engine combinations. So when it was released, there was the K car's 2.2 liter inline 4-cylinder with a carburetor, 2-barrel carburetor, and a 3-speed automatic and a 5-speed manual. The 2.2 liter was pretty weak, and the slant 6 that Chrysler had at the time was not appropriate to mount transversely, so they had to wait for a V6 to be developed, so they actually sourced a Mitsubishi 2.6 liter. The 2.2 from Chrysler made 96 horsepower, the 2.6 from Mitsubishi made all of 104, but it made a little bit of difference, and those were only available with the 3-speed automatic. There was, and I don't know that I've ever seen one, a Dodge version of the minivan, and primarily for commercial customers. During the development of this generation, one of the things they talked about was should they have 2 sliding doors on it. They decided not to do it because their commercial buyers would want that whole wall to mount shelving on and things like that. And they decided not to offer the second sliding door as an option because money was just so tight they couldn't afford to tool it up at the factory even if they charged extra for it. So it came out with that one sliding door. Now in 1987 they refreshed the whole line, gave it a mid-cycle refresh. The K-Cars 2.2 liter got upsized to 2.5 and had single point fuel injection. The Mitsubishi engine went up to 3 liters, got multi-port fuel injection, and finally in 1990 they came out with a 3.3 liter V6. In 1998, as I recall, Chrysler actually introduced the Town & Country, which was the top of the line, offering basically all of the options they had. And it must be remembered that many of these did have the option of 4-wheel drive. Now for this first generation, I've got to say, I can't find a great breakdown of all of the generations and how they sold year by year. Otherwise, I'd like to present that to you. But I did read that in the first year, they sold 209,000 minivans. Just remember, they predicted 215,000. So this was a huge success, and they pretty much absolutely nailed their forecast. All right, so the second generation of Chrysler minivans is called the AS platform. Now, this is a heavily revised version of the first generation, and the AS is not just a AS, it's actually that Chrysler changed to a 2-letter nomenclature for their platforms.
The evolution of the minivan is now complete.
It was sold in multiple variations now as the Caravan, the Mini Ram van, the Plymouth Voyager, the Chrysler Voyager in Europe, the Town & Country, and the Grand Caravan, of course. They did a little bit more to differentiate them from each other. They added more safety equipment, minor styling changes. Minivans were given dual airbags and 4-wheel disc brakes with ABS and all these other options, but the powertrains largely stayed the same. So in 1996, they introduced a completely new minivan. This one continued until the year 2000. This is the NS platform. And what really impresses me here is that Chrysler didn't sit on their laurels. They actually went back and started questioning a lot of their concepts of what they wanted to do. They considered lowering the floor, but people like to sit high. They considered moving the engine to the middle like the Toyota Previa had done. They really considered rethinking almost everything that they had assumed when they designed the first generation, but they ended up with basically the same thing.
First standard driver and passenger airbag. First integrated child safety seat. First and only easy out roller seats. First to offer both short and long wheelbase. First to offer dual sliding door.
Including adding that second sliding door as an extra cost option for people. They ended up with both standard wheelbase ended up being about 113 inches and a longer wheelbase for the grand versions of them. And engines were also finally revised. I want to say before I get into the engines, this is probably the prototypical, possibly the best example of a Chrysler minivan. I'm not saying it's the best minivan, but this period, the early 90s when they would have started designing this was, I've said many times on this channel, kind of the high water in my mind for Chrysler. They were an independent company. They were thinking outside the box. They were swinging for the fences, all of these different phrases I could use. But this is when they came out with the LH cars, the Cloud cars, the Neon. Unfortunately, they weren't known for highest quality interiors, but they were well designed and ergonomically quite good in my opinion. I always thought they were attractive, and they weren't known for the best reliability and quality in the world. But this is the application of their cab forward design language to a minivan. And this is also kind of the high watermark from the perspective of the competitors finally stopped trying to innovate. See, when the first minivans came out, of course, Chevy and Ford, General Motors and Ford came out with like the Aerostar and the Astro, more truck-based minivans. Now, they sold relatively well, and you had the Mazda MPV, Toyota came out with the Previa, eventually Honda came out with their Odyssey based on the Accord, which was too small. And you had other manufacturers like Mitsubishi and Nissan basically take what looked like cargo vans from Japan and sell them here as passenger vans with that engine right there between the seat. They stopped experimenting after this. And in the 90s is where you see true competitors to the Dodge minivans. The Ford Windstar came out, the General Motors Dustbuster minivans came out, eventually the Toyota Sienna, and then the Honda Odyssey. They stopped trying to do things different and outthink it. They just copied what Dodge did. And one more generation really showed a lot of innovation, but Dodge started to lose their dominance after that. They stopped owning the market and really just being a major competitor in it. And so this is really the prototypical minivan to me, and one of the most recognizable ones on the road. Now, for engines, they did have the 2.4 liter four-cylinder. They did have several different engines for export. They did have a Mitsubishi 3-liter V6 for non-California, and the 3.3 liter and a 3.8 liter eventually V6 that they offered. Now, the 4 cylinders and the Mitsubishi still used a 3-speed torque flight automatic, but the Chrysler did get that 4-speed ultra drive. I would argue by this point they had largely worked through many of the problems with that ultra drive. But this was a whole new platform designed from the ground up. And they spent time thinking about little things like adding an exterior handle for the rear hatch. They thought a lot about the seats too, making it with one handle that would unlatch the seats, making them easier to take out, and then outdo themselves with the next generation. Now, that next generation was the RS. Now, these were sold between 2001 and 2007. This is the 4th generation, and it is a refresh of the previous generation, slightly larger body. They made the headlights larger, sold it in a variety of different platforms, of course. But the big thing about this one to me was the introduction of stow and go seating. This is one of the most innovative ideas that anybody in the minivan world has ever come up with, and that is on the Grand version, the long wheelbase version of these vans. You could actually lift up a hatch and fold the seat down like a transformer and have a floor. All the other innovations they've done on the seats and how they moved and how you could release them didn't ever change the fact that these things are really heavy and really cumbersome to get in and out. So why not just make them fold away? It was absolutely genius. Now, this is when Chrysler had merged with Daimler, so we're starting to see the impact of that. I think you see it on the dashboards, for example. And to me, this one, while I like the bigger grille and I like the bigger headlights, this one looks like the previous generation just puffed up a little bit. It lost some of its edginess to me. For that reason, I don't know, it's kind of the start of the downfall. Now, powertrains, they continue to offer the same versions as previously. You've got the 4-cylinder and the 3-liter Mitsubishi 3-speed Torque Flight, and then of course they had the 3.3 liter and the 3.8 liter with their 4-speed automatic transmission as well. The 5th generation was called the RT platform, and this was another ground-up redesign, and they did away with that puffy styling I just talked about and really went more edgy. It's not bad looking, it's pretty distinctive, the interior is pretty beautiful, and this generation was sold between 2008 and honestly 2020. And they really focused on this more of interior stuff, offering more amenities on the interior, moving into more infotainment. The stow and go became standard. They did away with the short wheelbase models, and what would have been the short wheelbase minivan became the Dodge Journey, a brutally bad crossover vehicle. But they did offer, in addition to stow and go, they did offer something called swivel and go, where the second row seats could turn around. I don't think it ever really caught on. This generation, they also sold, rebadged as the Volkswagen Routan, which was a massive failure. And in 2011, it went through a mid-cycle refresh, which changed styling and functionality, really focusing on just making it a better vehicle. They're changing the instrument panel, the instrument cluster. We'll talk about powertrains in a minute, but more integrated controls, better heating and cooling, revising the ride and suspension and handling, and improving the lighting, things like that. Really fine-tuning it and making it better. This is a good minivan. I gotta tell you, this is a good minivan. I kind of like the creased look of it. I don't love it. I just like it a lot. And I like driving them. I just don't trust them like I trust an Odyssey. And that's the problem, is by this generation, it's Chrysler, and they've ended up being bankrupt and going through Fiat Chrysler. They're producing a pretty good minivan, but the Sienna and the Odyssey are just levels of excellence. And the Chrysler products are really good, but they don't stand out like they did early on. They're just another strong competitor in the marketplace. Now, they dropped the 2.4 liter. The 3.3 liter engine became standard. The 3.8 liter V6 was optional, and they ended up with a 4 liter V6 as an optional top level engine. In 2011, all those engines were dropped, and the brand new Pentastar 3.6 liter V6 was made standard. They did offer 4-speed automatic on that 3.3 liter V6. Everything else got a new 6-speed automatic, including that 3.6 liter V6. Sales have remained steady. Finally, I can get some sales data for these generations. Between 2008 and 2019, they sold 100-ish thousand. I mean, there were years where it was 90, 95,000. There were years where it was 134, 151. But generally, even 100+ thousand sales in the United States every single year. Far from dominant, but still a very, very healthy number. So in 2016, the final generation, the current generation of the Chrysler minivans rolled out. Now called the Pacifica. It was a brand new platform. Sergio Marchionne, CEO of FCA at the time, said they were going to invest $2 billion to design the platform and upfit the Windsor assembly plant. And I mentioned that because remember, the first one cost $500 to $700 million. It's a major, major investment, and they, a lot of ways, simplified it. Sadly, they got rid of the Dodge version. Plymouth has long since been gone. It is just the Chrysler. But you'll notice from the previous generation, I said that went to 2020. This one started in 2016 because they kept the old version because it was still selling so well. They kept it for years while they introduced this brand new one over here. It only came with 2 powertrain options, that 3.6 liter V6 with a 6-speed and a plug-in hybrid. It's okay, and in 2021 it went through a refresh to change the front grille and do some other things. overall, I think it's remained a relatively good seller. 2016 sold 62,000, then it sold over 100,000. In 2020, the last information I've got here is it sold about 94, almost 94,000 in the United States. So it still continues to sell pretty well, but a long way away from its dominant position. And this generation is okay. It looks narrow and it looks long, and I don't know, it's just really, really big. They are extremely nice. They are extremely nice inside, and they're not bad looking, but there's something missing. You know, that there's something special missing in them. I love the story of the minivan. I think it's so underappreciated in our society. My wife has had two minivans before, and even though she's moved on to a sport utility, she misses her minivan. She misses being able to have that sliding door move open while she's walking up to it, throw her stuff in the back, close it, and drive away. She misses how easy it is to get in and out of in parking spaces. She misses the luxury and how well it rides, and the fact that we can throw plywood in the back of it when we needed to. This is a massive, massive market that Chrysler unlocked, and there's few success stories like this in the automotive world. They're still building what I think is a good minivan. It would absolutely make my list of things to consider. And I'm so proud of them for 10 years, 15, over maybe 20 years of constantly innovative, constantly making their vans better and trying to stay up on top of the pack. And for 10 to 15 years, absolutely dominating the market and making everybody else change them. It's that spirit I feel is really missing from Chrysler, and I don't think we'll ever see it again. But they've still got a minivan we can enjoy, even if they don't have multiple versions of it. So, appreciate it, guys. Let me know your thoughts below.